Welcome back, everyone. I'm happy to introduce Saied Abbasi, who will talk about theme development, PHP versus JavaScript. Saied has worked in web development for the better part of the last decade, and he's the founder of a digital agency called WPHelp.co. He's taught courses on front-end development and WordPress. He's currently exploring React and Frontity, and he will share his latest findings with us right now. So welcome, Saied.
Well, thank you, Nico. I appreciate it. It's very cool to be here. I want to do a quick thank you to Joe and Sumner and the WordCamp Santa Clarita team. I'm happy that we were able to do this virtually, and I hope that everyone is safe and doing well during this very odd time. So it's nice to all be together doing a WordCamp. Okay, so my talk is theme development, PHP versus JavaScript. I don't really know if there's a versus or where exactly this title came from, but we're going with it. It's too late now. My name is Saied Abbasi, as Nico said. I'm the founder of WPHelp.co. My Twitter handle is there, WPHelpCo. If you want to say hello, please do. I also quickly want to thank all of these individuals who took the time to talk with me and share their insights and their expertise. If there is anything that is truly substantial from this talk, please rest assured that it came directly from one of these individuals. Okay, let's get into it. So maybe you're familiar with Plinko, maybe not. This is a not Wheel of Fortune, The Price is Right game where a ball drops from the top and it can go anywhere, it bounces around, and then eventually it lands in one of the slots at the bottom. When I think about theme development or web development in the sphere of WordPress, I think a lot about how you can really enter at so many different spaces, and the use case for the particular project or your particular skill set or your interest can vary so much, and where you land can vary so much. And the WordPress community, because of that, has really amazing designers and content editors and webmasters and web developers and people that are using page builders or people that are using WordPress abstractions or people that are using raw PHP. And I think because there are all those entry points and all those places to land, that over time, since 2003, WordPress has created such a robust knowledge base that the learning curve to becoming a WordPress developer is so gentle and accessible because of that. So I want to kind of go from there to looking at a common journey to web development in WordPress from the PHP perspective. So let's go back in the day. So to elaborate on that a little bit, this gentle learning curve, when you first get into WordPress and you want to start building websites, you might go and utilize some plugins, and a plugin will allow you to extend some functionality of WordPress without knowing anything about coding. Just, go search for it, research it a little bit, make sure it's compatible. It'll tell you there, activate it, you're good to go. You can tap the community. There are a number of blogs or other plugin developers or all these different resources that you can tap into. And then from there, maybe you land on a page builder and you can start making custom layouts and move pieces around. And you could even vend your services at that point and start making websites for friends, colleagues, clients, whatever. Further on in that journey, you might start to use a little bit of CSS and you're providing some custom styling. You go to Stack Overflow and you see a snippet of some PHP code and you copy and paste it into your functions.php. You might not be perfectly aware of everything that it's doing, but you trust this individual, you test it, and voila, you have some magic code. And you do this enough times and you start to understand, like, oh, I've seen this before. And you start to understand how the pieces connect a little bit better. From there, you might start using the abstractions that WordPress gives you on top of PHP to do some templating. What I mean by that is like you might access the post object, you might say the content to get the page content, the title, and all these things that are really handy and built into WordPress that allow you to be coding in PHP, but are abstractions upon coding in raw PHP, so to speak. Your journey might progress from there. A common next step is to utilize advanced custom fields. Advanced custom fields plus something that would also allow you to have custom content types really starts to reveal the content management aspect of WordPress, and that it's truly a dynamic CMS that can handle much more than a static page and a blog post. You can have a custom content type of doctor, and that doctor can have a name, a title, a specialty, an insurance they provide for, or whatever else. And you don't necessarily need advanced custom fields to do this, but it is a common step that you might take. From that point, when you have this custom content, you need to now create a custom layout for it, and your templating skills are probably getting better. Your CSS gets better. You're moving those custom snippets from your functions.php, and you're making your own plugins because they're really one and the same. It's really just placement and portability. And then somewhere along that journey, the kids are in the back seat and they see the JavaScript jQuery theme park, and they start freaking out. They're like, Dad, pull over. And so you go to the JavaScript rest stop. You learn how to make a menu toggle in and out, and you like change some interactivity using JavaScript and jQuery. And at that point, you've made it. You've reached enlightenment. You know all that there is about WordPress, theme development. You feel great about yourself. You and all your WordPress dev friends are hanging out on the beach doing yoga. You're back to the office after that beautiful vacation. You look up at your bookshelf. You have all the knowledge that that you've attained staring back at you. And then at some point in that journey, for many developers, the WordPress REST API was introduced. And I don't have the exact timeline of this, but I remember first hearing about it at a WordCamp in New York, maybe 2015 or so. I'm not sure if it was a plugin or part of core at that point. And at that WordCamp, I remember there were a couple of people that were doing React themes on top of WordPress using the WordPress REST API. Single page applications were kind of like a buzz acronym, whether at WordCamp or outside of the WordCamp community. And at this point, it was like, what's React? And React is like, it's amazing. It's super popular. Everyone wants to learn it. And you might have like faced it with a little bit of like, yeah, right. We'll see if it stays around. It's very much stayed around. It's immensely popular. It's part of WordPress core, part of what backs Gutenberg now, which we'll get to in a second. And with the WordPress REST API, it never went anywhere. It's gotten better over time, but I'm noting here that it's back, and we'll revisit this also later in the talk to describe some of its more prevalent use cases and how the popularity of utilizing the REST API is dramatically increasing over the last year, 2 years. In a similar fashion, Gutenberg gets introduced as a plugin. It creates a lot of buzz. There's excitement, there's dismay, there's frustration. Why is it still saving to the content? What about meta fields? I'm so frustrated. Why is it React? And there was a lot of frustration, and the days of sitting on the beach in Enlightenment were slowly drifting away. And so you decide to adopt it. And for a lot of people, that meant installing the classic editor and utilizing ACF and kind of just going to like back to what they were comfortable with. And when I get into the JavaScript end of things in a moment, or even this right here, I don't say it with any sort of judgment. I think that there are use cases for every project, depending on what your client needs in terms of like being a webmaster to interact with their website, like a lot of people are running businesses. So in terms of time to go out and learn something, or future stability, if you know that this works. Gutenberg's part of core, so I'm not going to really like unravel this like whole debate, but this was a reality in a lot of cases. And then at some point you maybe start to fold and you say, okay, I'm going to learn it. It's here to stay, whatever. And then you go to learn JavaScript. And when I say JavaScript, I'm really like interchangeably talking about like modern web development and how to develop locally and utilize modern tooling. And what I'm trying to brush up against here is that in that learning curve into JavaScript, there are some initial hurdles that can be really daunting and hard to zoom out and get a big picture of. And Chris Ferdinandi, who's an educator in the JavaScript space, has a podcast called Vanilla JS Podcast. And he has a 2-minute episode that is pretty much just like a self-esteem booster on like imposter syndrome. So anytime you're feeling down about your JavaScript skills, just go here and get your morale back up from Chris. As Gutenberg has become a ever more present part of WordPress development and WordPress content management, it's also been steadily improving. And as people sort of got past some of the initial frustrations, there is a lot of awesome utility that's baked into it. Columns have gotten better. Reusable blocks are pretty amazing. You can drag and drop and have an interface that's similar to what you're seeing on the front end, on the back end. There are a lot of benefits to the content manager. And I also think that with like newer generations coming into the space of web management, having an interface that is counting on you to be a little bit more tech savvy can be a nice exchange. Beyond this, you have plugins such as like cadence blocks or atomic blocks I've heard talked about at my local meetup, where you're also starting to see some of that. I'm not necessarily a developer, mirroring in the JavaScript space to the WordPress PHP development space of allowing content managers to sort of go beyond what's native to Gutenberg without necessarily knowing how to make a custom block and come in and extend that functionality. And from there, you again buckle down and you decide, okay, I need to learn JavaScript. So from here, I originally imagined this talk happening in a building like everybody, with everybody. And because that's not the case, I wanted to still cultivate some sort of a conversation as to whatever frustration someone might be feeling with like learn JavaScript deeply, and also how something that I became particularly interested in was that learning curve within WordPress PHP being so gentle, and to learn JavaScript deeply being a bit challenging and monumentous to a number of people. So a little bit more primer. I also realized that like as we think about this bridge from PHP developer familiar with WordPress going into more of a JavaScript-oriented land of Gutenberg or the REST API or just modern web development standards, we also need to consider that like there's a bridge from the JavaScript developer world into the WordPress world, and that has a lot of interesting implications as well. And we started on this idea of Plinko with The Price is Right, where the ball jumps and there are a bunch of pegs, and in the world of WordPress, it's really accessible to be a content editor, a page builder, a PHP developer, a front-end person, a designer, etc. Now, in this new iteration of JavaScript entering into WordPress development and being an active part, we now have a shot of a pachinko bar casino. I'm not exactly sure the appropriate name for it, which is what the Plinko game is derived from. And the concept here is, again, that like we have JavaScript developers, we have WordPress developers, and we're all trying to learn. And that initial curve is really frustrating, and learn JavaScript deeply is maybe a bit like too challenging to swallow if you want to get going. But I think in reality that we can create that same gentle learning curve that we've developed since 2003 with WordPress and PHP and theming in the JavaScript space. I think part of it will take time, and I think part of it's already organically happening with this Plenko type thing where if you aren't hyper familiar with JavaScript, or you are hyper familiar with JavaScript, but you're not familiar with WordPress, you're going to find different solutions. People are going to develop different utilities to help you with your skill set to dive deeper into developing with JavaScript. And from these conversations I had with developers, I started to break out into these like 4 potential suggestions as to like how you can continue learning. And I think that this segmented learning and dipping your toes in and out and doing a little bit here and there is really going to end up cultivating a more natural and less intimidating learning curve for everybody. So we have learn how to adapt your PHP to Gutenberg, and we'll touch on each of these. Learn Gutenberg shallowly. This is a quote from Antonio Villegas. He did a talk that's on WordPress.tv that you should check out. Learn React deeply, I believe, is also something said by Antonio in his talk. And then learn JavaScript deeply is, of course, from Matt's State of the WordPress. I'm not exactly sure what it's titled, in 2015. Okay, so thinking about learning how to adapt your PHP to Gutenberg. And again, here, I'm not coming at this with any judgment. I think learn JavaScript deeply is fantastic advice, but I do think that there's more of that WordPress has benefited so much from this organic and accessible learning curve that having that with Gutenberg and with JavaScript is something that I'm particularly interested in. So learn how to adapt your PHP to Gutenberg. So what I'm talking about here is, yet again, advanced custom fields. And advanced custom fields will allow you to create custom blocks within Gutenberg using a WordPress admin UI that a lot of developers are already very familiar with. And I talked to some colleagues of mine, and some that had particular frustrations along the lines of like time to learn JavaScript being something intimidating, or trying to operate a business and just like financial needs to still make new projects and wanting to adapt to Gutenberg. And this was a nice segue into that matched their current skill set. I talked to other developers that I've always respected for being people that jump on new technologies and maybe aren't using that in every production case, but are hyper aware of the changing atmosphere of web development. And in both ends of the spectrum, I found that like there were common use cases where people were very excited about ACF blocks and using them. And again, I'm not really advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying how JavaScript has started to enter WordPress development, and how it's starting to shape out in a lot of different facets and a lot of different patterns that you could enter into. I talked to another individual. I randomly talked to a few people that work in publishing at like a large scale. And one of them had a particular background in JavaScript, knew lots of JavaScript, doesn't know a lot of React, and works with some huge publishing houses and on WordPress with his JavaScript background. And for him, a big goal of his is just to make an admin UI that's extremely simple. And for his use case, he finds Gutenberg to perhaps be like a little overwhelming for a lot of people that want to come in and just write some copy. And in that case, he is still leaning on ACF, or kind of bumping up against some frustrations of Gutenberg. So I think that, again, like your use case and your skill set and how you apply that is fairly varied. So learn Gutenberg shallowly. So in Antonio's talk, he breaks down why it can be hard to start to learn modern web development, why it could be hard to start developing within Gutenberg. And I think he actually gives like fantastic advice as to how to start to learn Gutenberg and applying it. And I don't know whether it's shallowly or intermediately or deeply, but I do like the suggestion here of the wording of a more gentle learning curve of like, you don't have to be an expert. And he also is acknowledging that like, you also don't have to be an expert in React. Just like WordPress has put a layer of abstraction over raw PHP where you can do things like the title, the post, etc. You have a similar layer of abstraction that sits on top of React that makes it more accessible as a WordPress developer to hop in and start learning some of these new things. And he does this sequentially by noting tooling, which we're actually going to talk about in a little more depth, which refers to like that initial setup to get going in creating and working with Gutenberg blocks. He goes from there to discussing modern syntaxes, which again goes back kind of into the topic of tooling. And then he says, like, when it comes to React, you don't actually need to know React to start developing within Gutenberg. You really just need to have an understanding of JSX. JSX looks like some combination of JavaScript and HTML. It's actually incredibly easy to read, even from like a novice perspective. And then from there, he notes that, again, you don't need this complete understanding of all the functionality of React. Instead, you can rely upon the library of components that already exist inside Gutenberg and draw them out and make sort of a collage that matches your needs to make custom blocks. And he's also noting that there are functions that you can tie into to sort of piece together the custom functionality that you want. There's a ton of stuff on Gutenberg, I'm sure even at this conference. So I'm not going to go crazy deep there. But if you are super interested in learning about Gutenberg, I do recommend checking out Riyad's blog. He's a core contributor. Zac Gordon, of course, has spearheaded a lot of education in this space in regards to JavaScript within WordPress and to development within Gutenberg, so check that out. And then Ahmad and Maida are the authors behind a very popular GitHub repository that helps you create your first Guten block. So check those out. Lastly and briefly, upcoming in a way that's exciting is this concept of block-based themes. So currently Gutenberg is editing the content region of your template. In a future iteration of Gutenberg, which is still experimental, the goal, and I think the goal like from the beginning of Gutenberg, is to have blocks that are not so concerned about the content and can universally go wherever on your page, whether that's the header, the sidebar, the footer, the content. And I'm taking this slide here from Morten Hendrickson, who was talking about CSS Grid. And I think he like probably points this out in his talk, but the way that those two could lay on top of each other is something that's kind of interesting. CSS Grid and like a block-based theme, the way you can move things around. Okay, so I'm going to talk about tooling. Give me one moment. Okay, so from here, we're going to now go and talk about like that initial learning curve, that initial hill to learning modern web development, to developing within JavaScript that gets a lot of people tripped up, or can seem a little bit daunting to start implementing and working with. And I'm going to steal information from Tyler McGinnis here. I hope that he and no one else is offended. I highly recommend going and learning his tutorials. And I'm kind of just going to walk through an example that he gives in one of his classes that I thought was a really nice way of sort of moving some of the abstraction of React out to help see that like it's not so different from something that you might be used to. So here, Tyler is providing an example that if you're familiar with HTML, shouldn't be so scary. Up here at the top, we have our head tag. Within our head tag, we're dropping in a few scripts. This is also where we would like load in custom fonts. You're essentially going to an external site to grab information or libraries or things that your site needs. And then the body is what we're seeing on the page. And within the body, we're running some JavaScript. Cool. This is a functioning React app. It's an incredibly simple functioning React app, but it isn't relying on this tooling and modern workflow that can be a little scary. He goes from there to show a basic React component, and he's noting that up here at the top, we're importing and we're exporting. And this is kind of at the heart of how you would write React, in that you are thinking about things in terms of components. You're thinking about pieces that you piece together on a page to create a broader application. And in order to have those pieces know how to tie into one another, one of the ways that you're exchanging information is through this import and export functionality. So now we're getting into tooling. So if you were to try and load this in a browser, it's not going to know what to do with, in this first case, this bit of HTML JavaScript mashup. And this is JSX. So our first tool here is Babel. And Babel, like the Tower of Babel, is all about translation. So we have JSX coming in, and on the other side, we're spitting out vanilla JavaScript, something that a modern browser can interpret. When we think about the limitations of browsers, we might not have enough of an understanding to know that JavaScript, there are modern aspects of JavaScript that a browser cannot interpret. But when we think about Internet Explorer, the browser of everyone's dreams, a lot of us are very familiar with the limitations of Internet Explorer and a lot of like the backwards compatibility checks that we need to do. And just like in Internet Explorer, there are limitations to what every browser can do in comparison to what a language is doing. So the language JavaScript has provided a lot of tooling and syntax that's not necessarily synced up with where the browser is at, and tools like Babel help to translate that backwards while still allowing you to develop with modern standards. The next tool, briefly, I want to talk about is Webpack. And oftentimes when we look at Webpack, we get an image like this or something that's like 10 times more complicated. And to me, it's just one of those images that like makes your brain kind of tune out. So instead, we're going to look at the ocean for a second. In this, we're going to jump away from this and then come back. In this original example, we have this import and export, right? And this is how all our pieces are talking to each other. What Webpack is allowing you to do is to have this functionality of having all these different pieces talk to each other. And before you actually launch it on a site, all of those pieces need to know how they fit together, in what order, and Webpack is taking care of that piece for you and putting in those scripts in your head tag on the page in the final product. So these guys here, and it might compile it into a single script. But in the end, we're just ending up with something that we're all fairly familiar with. The last bit of tooling I'm going to touch on is NPM, and NPM, a very easy way to think about this is you have your WordPress repository of plugins. This is a repository of packages which are very similar to the concept of a plugin. It's portable functionality that you can reuse on different sites. That was a bit of a detour into tooling, but I wanted to do it because I think that this initial hurdle is something like once you're past, you can start messing around and start learning and start getting some feedback that you're getting somewhere, while the tooling can kind of just feel like a wall that's hard to get past. In WordPress theme development over the last couple of years, even if you're still using older paradigms based on PHP and you're still using the classic editor and you're still using advanced custom fields or whatever, a lot of base themes and a lot of theme developers have started incorporating Sass into their workflows as well as browser sync. If you're using these tools, there is a very high chance that you're already leaning on some of the tooling that we just discussed in your WordPress builds, so that next, you might already have some use case examples where you're using these things that you might not be aware of, that it's one-to-one with the tooling you would need to start doing modern JavaScript development. Okay, so something that would be nice about the approach of Learn React Deeply is that when you step away from a layer of abstraction, when you get behind that layer of abstraction, it can really deepen your understanding of something. So if that demonstration of tooling that was taken from Tyler McGinnis helped to kind of understand what the tooling is doing behind the scenes. The tooling provides a layer of abstraction for you that is convenient, but once you get where like what the pieces are actually doing, it can help you feel more comfortable using that tooling or debugging an error that it throws or something, because you know what its end goal is, you know what it's trying to do. Learning React deeply could help remove some of the abstraction that WordPress's JavaScript API, and I'm using API here as like a layer of abstraction that WordPress puts on top of React to make it easier to develop with JavaScript in Gutenberg. This is the exact same thing as calling the content in your PHP. So I'm suggesting Learn React to remove that abstraction will help you, is one approach to learn JavaScript deeply. And when I think about this, something I've landed upon that I find super exciting and does add its own layer of abstraction, but in a friendly way, is Frontity. Frontity is a framework for theming that will put you in React land using WordPress as your backend CMS. And the beauty of Frontity, and what I mean in terms of abstraction here, is that everything is already wired up for you. So all that tooling that we just talked about, Frontity has that already set up for you. It also has routing set up for you, which can be something tricky to navigate between pages in React. And beyond that, Frontity is focused on WordPress. So this is a really interesting use case where you can develop in React. A JavaScript developer that's working with WordPress and has a client that's doing something on the back end can develop in React if they're more familiar with that. And it's also focused on WordPress, so it's creating tooling and connectivity between WordPress and React for you, so that if you are a WordPress developer that wants to get their hands dirty and start messing around with React, it's really easy to get up and going with this. Okay, so I'm going to quickly explain what Headless is and explain how Frontity is allowing you to develop in React will still have a WordPress backend. So this comes back to the WordPress REST API, which I mentioned was introduced at some point, was talked about at WordCamps, but the use cases didn't seem like so common. In 2017, less than 2% of the top 10,000 sites online were using React. Presently, of those top 10,000 sites, it is 13.7%. WordPress has a huge market share of websites, and this concept of utilizing WordPress as a CMS that has a ton of support, that has a ton of contributions from a lot of people, that's maintained, that content editors feel comfortable with, and combining that with a front end that is entirely in modern web development and utilizing React is a really interesting, powerful combination. So in terms of how this works, in terms of how you do headless, on the back end of every website, you have a database. And a database may be an abstract thing, but essentially it's like a table in Excel. So in this example, we have Bob, Maria, Bobo, Todd, and Ted. They all have their age, and they all have like a true-false value as to whether they know JavaScript. All of that's stored in a database. What a REST API does is publish that same information to a URL. So it makes it accessible online so that other resources can go and tap it and essentially get a copy or a mirror of the database and use it in a new way. So Frontity is using the WordPress API to tap a WordPress install, get the information from the database, and allow you to start developing in React. Zac Gordon was kind enough to reply to some questions I sent him, and he wrote me this. Outside of WordPress, we finally have solid tooling for going headless. Frontity and Gatsby are the clear leaders in this, so many devs are working to understand these better. The limitation here continues to be plugin functionality. Do you choose non-WordPress tools for certain things, or try to extend plugins via the REST API or WP GraphQL? I had the chance also to talk to Pablo, who is one of the founders of Frontity, as well as Michael, who works on the Frontity team. And in no way counter to what Zac is saying, but to address this ability to extend WordPress plugins or look for tooling that exists within the React space, I wanted to quickly note that this is something that's very much on the mind of the Frontity developers. And what does this actually mean in terms of practicality? When you're jumping out of WordPress and you're developing in React, there's this like question mark as to what's like carried over, and whether you're using a plugin that can be accessible. So in this case, I just want to quickly note that Frontity is using or has developed a plugin on the WordPress end that would take something like Yoast and make it accessible via the API. Beyond that, they're working on extensions in the React realm that would allow you to maintain things like comments and Google Analytics and GDPR. And then members of the Frontity community have developed an extension to sort of port over the ability of Contact Form 7. So I think that this is like a super interesting use case that is bridging that gap for both the JavaScript developer and the WordPress developer, and making it more accessible to jump in and get deeper and learn React deeply. And last little bit on this is that they do have like a 30-minute setup on their site where you can spring up a theme with them, plug in your URL, and it will pull information automatically for you into it. So you can get your blog in React, which is really promising versus just like going and dealing with that initial tooling hurdle. Okay. So wanted to sneak in a photo of my cat. There have already been a few. That's pretty much what that's about. Going forward, places to learn. Tyler McGinnis is amazing. Frontity, check out the documentation. Zac Gordon has a number of courses, and he has some new boot camps out. Wes Boss is an amazing educator, as well as Chris Ferdinandi. I'm going to breathe on the tree. I think my biggest takeaway here is that learn JavaScript deeply perhaps is not a gentle learning curve in so many words. But I think that as a community, if we like learn little pieces here and there, and people that know more develop things that make learning JavaScript deeply more accessible, that will again start to grow a gentle learning curve that WordPress is so famous for and so accessible because of. Boom.
Well, perfect timing. Like I was about to let you know that we're close to Q&A question or time. So there's a few questions. First, I'm going to read a couple of comments. Mark is saying this is a great talk, and it's a good idea to review the tooling. And Brian said that you're doing a great job explaining JS complexity in a simpler, more understanding way. Just wanted to put those out there.
Thank you.
And then first question from Calco. Any best practice suggestions for converting an existing TinyMC site to Gutenberg?
I unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know if there's an existing plugin. I do know that there are, a ton of people that are super smart out there. So I'm sure that there is some use case, some example somewhere. But unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that.
Brian is asking, he's building a process to extract online manuals in WordPress via the REST API. And he wants to convert HTML to LaTeX to generate a PDF. So he says, any JS ideas for parsing JSON to LaTeX?
I have worked on something before that was creating PDFs from like an old school like PHP library. I have never done that in JavaScript. I don't know as well. Sorry, everybody. Everything I like kind of knew, I brushed on, and it wasn't a lot.
Megan is asking, are those your own drawings? Because they're adorable.
My girlfriend drew those for me. I've been told in my life by several different people that did not talk to each other that I look like a sloth, and so I eventually just like adopted it. And so those drawings were done by my girlfriend. She's awesome.
Let me see if there's anybody else sending questions. I don't see anything for now. I do have a question. This is personally because I did a pretty much the similar path that you explained, like little by little, ended up using ACF. So right now I am using a lot of ACF and PHP. So would you recommend going forward completely dropping ACF and using Gutenberg completely, or do you recommend like a mixed approach, or what's your process? What are you going towards?
Sure. When I talked to one colleague of mine, when I was talking about adapting your PHP to Gutenberg, he's someone that I've always kind of admired. How he, like, right when like Gatsby came out, he like jumped on it and made a personal blog in Gatsby. He introduced me to Sass, like and Gulp and a lot of these things. So when I touched base with him as to like what he's using, I was surprised to hear that he was still using ACF blocks. Mm-hmm. I tried to like break it down and see like, like, are you gonna switch to Gutenberg? And he admitted that like probably everything I'm doing I could do in Gutenberg, like almost definitely. And it more than likely is time that like I started making that switch over. I am 100% advocating for learning more JavaScript. I don't really know, like, if you have a site that you need to get out in 2 weeks and this is what you're familiar with, ACF is awesome, so use it. But I do think taking some time to learn here and there and learn shallowly and learn like from time to time is a good approach.
Okay, cool. Let me see if there's anything else. I don't see anything. One thing I didn't want to mention also that we have people in the comment from Iceland and Australia, so it's like a very international talk.
Very cool. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Peter, behind the scenes. And thank you, everybody, for coming and listening.
Wait, there's one person, a follow-up from Brian about the latex.
Cool.
Do you know in PHP of any libraries in particular? Or
if you sent me like a message on Twitter, I could probably figure out what I used on that project. Something with a 2 in it.
Cool. I think we have a couple of minutes to wrap up. So thank you so much. That's a great presentation. I mean, especially it's relevant to my interest, so it's really good to be here.